Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the CG campus. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. We're here to celebrate a truly unique occasion, one that wouldn't be taking place if humanity wasn't on the brink of nuclear annihilation 50 years ago. As you all came onto the CG campus, you may have noticed 4 large and distinct banners in our front windows. These posters make up part of a major and first of its kind here transmedia project on one of the more significant events in recent world history. The Armageddon Letters project has put the Balsley School of International Affairs and the CG campus at the forefront of the 50th anniversary of the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And tonight we celebrate the new book that comes out of this project, The Armageddon Letters, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Written by Janet Lang and James Blight, research professors at the Balsley School of International Affairs. This new publication can be purchased here tonight. Lang and Blight, who are colleagues and spouses, are award-winning scholars, renowned and recognized for their critical examination of historic events in modern American history. This evening, they'll present their new book to you in unique transmedia setting using short films and graphic art. Director of the Balsley School and CG Chair of Global Security, David Welch, will help guide and moderate the discussion with James and Janet. There'll be a question and answer period for our presenters, at which point we ask you to use the microphones found in the aisles. Following their presentation, you're invited to the CG campus lobby for the opening and a tour of an art exhibit in the corridors all around the entire first floor of the campus, entitled Canadian Artists Portray the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've been asked to emphasize that the exhibit starts clockwise from the marble wall, so go clockwise around the corridor that goes around the entire courtyard. And to get this evening underway, I will now introduce the executive producer of the Armageddon Letters, Mr. Don Morrison. Since Mr. Morrison's retirement from Research in Motion in 2011, he's been actively involved in exploring the practical application of secular and existential ethics, given where we are right now in our global evolution. Mr. Morrison's work at the Mind and Life Institute at the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values and his own initiative, the Compassion Project, seek to explore the causal relationship between a person's inner transformation and their external behavior, particularly exploring how a mindfulness discipline can transform an individual to become a more effective leader and human being. In addition, Mr. Morrison is involved in many philanthropic endeavors through his family foundation, most particularly the work of Free the Children, both in North America and overseas in countries like Kenya and India. Mr. Morrison is also a member of the board of the MasterCard Foundation and is chair of the Digital Information and Authentication Council for Canada. So please now welcome Don Morrison to the stage.
Thanks, Fred. Very kind of you and very appropriate and wonderful remarks just to get us underway. And thanks, everybody, for coming. It's just a great pleasure to be here and be a part of this evening. And before I get started, it'd probably be remiss of me not to say how delighted and appreciative I am as an ex-employee of RIM to be standing in this auditorium made possible by my dear friend and colleague Jim Balsley, and the correspondingly great work that Mike is doing just across the street. I can tell you a place like the Mind and Life Institute that Fred mentioned was actually started by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and they're very cognizant of the work that both Jim and Mike are doing here. Perhaps in that context, maybe a little bit more about what Mike is doing in the area of physics and what have you, but it's quite remarkable. We've got these two, I can say they're young because they're both 8 years younger than I am, these two young Canadians, and just how they have given back to the community and how all of us are beneficiaries of it. So I wanted to start off by just being thoughtful for a moment about the tremendous generosity of both Jim and Mike. This is a really great honor for me, and it's a culmination of, quite frankly, a series of serendipitous accidents that occurred over the course of the last few years I first met Jim and Janet right here doing essentially what we just finished doing, which was going out for dinner. And it was on that occasion that David Welch, who had just recently come from as co-leader of the Trudeau Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Toronto, had come down here as one of the first bright lights to Jim's new school and to CG, had invited us out for dinner because Jim and Janet had just completed this documentary called Virtual JFK, which if you haven't seen it, I'd really encourage you to. And Debbie and I, just being sort of typical Canadians and Torontonians, it's absolutely blown away that we could be sitting down and having dinner with these two exceptional people that had really dedicated their lives to studying what had gone on during not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the entire history of the Kennedy administration, and beyond that had engaged themselves with something that they created, which I don't know if you know this, but they created something called critical oral history, and they would bring people back who had been in conflict with each other, whether it was Vietnam, most recently Iran, but also those involved with the Cuban Missile Crisis, particularly in 1992 when they assembled the remaining members of the U.S. administration of that time with the Khrushchev administration and with Castro. And they had the courage and the willingness and leadership to actually pull this off. And it's actually quite remarkable. So the question then becomes, why did they do that? And really what I feel in a nutshell, what Jim and Janet are doing is they're pointing at something, right? And they're pointing at something with this book, the Armageddon Letters. They're pointing at this very same thing with Virtual JFK. And they're pointing at the very same thing with the documentary that they did with The Fog of War with Bob McNamara. And that is what they're saying to us is, let's not repeat our ignorance in history where we almost came to the point where we blew ourselves up. And let the lessons that occurred in 1962, for example, guide us to what we shouldn't do today. And could it be any more prescient than what we find ourselves in today with so many nations having nuclear weapons? And that was why it was so easy for me to want to be a small part of this, along with David and Jim and Janet and gentleman Koji Matsutani, who you'll meet. And he is the gentleman that has actually produced the website, the blogs, and all the documentaries and what have you that you'll see. So I'm very much indebted to David Welch for making the introductions, and hope he can get back ultimately to doing what he loves to do, following his remarkable and unselfish leadership of bringing the Balsley School together. There's no person in my life that's affected me more than a gentleman by the name of Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, died in 1968. But he was one of these people that during the 60s was very much caught up in the events that were going on with the Cold War. And one of the things that Jim and Janet did earlier this year is they actually gave me a Merton book that was a diary of a series of letters that he had written. And you'll get to know Jim and Janet a little bit more for those of you that don't. But what Jim did for me last night was he actually wrote me a 9-page speech just to guide me along, which is it just shows you how selfless and unbelievably generous these two are. But in it, he shared with me something I'm going to share with you, which is a letter that in effect was written by Thomas Merton to Ethel Kennedy, who, as you know, was the wife of the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, in December of 1961, less than a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the reason why I'm going to read this, I mean, apart from the fact that Jim found it, and it happens to be Thomas Merton, is because of the words. It's very brief, but the words are very relevant to where we are today. And once again, I come back to this thing that Jim and Janet are pointing at. So these are the words that Merton wrote to Ethel Kennedy. These are not easy times to live in, and there are no easy answers. I think the fact that the president works overtime, President Kennedy, at trying to get people to face the situation as it really is, may be the greatest thing that he is doing. Certainly, our basic need is for truth, and not for images and slogans that engineer consent. We're living in a dream world. We do not know ourselves or our adversaries. We're myths to ourselves, and they are myths to us. And we're secretly persuaded that we can shoot it out like the sheriffs on television. And what he's saying is that we actually think that there's a myth that you can have a contained nuclear war. I'm no nuclear expert, but I can't imagine a contained nuclear war. And quite frankly, those of us that were alive in the 50s or the 60s can recall how the whole disposition of where the world was, that we were quite worried about the prospect of nuclear war. And one of the things that I'm hoping with this project that culminates with the publication of Jim and Janet's book, which, by the way, is already sold out. So we have to go to a second printing. That's just how remarkably well received this book is. The purpose of all of this is to remind our kids to be just as mindful about this threat and feel that we are not done until all the nuclear warheads on this planet are gone. And that's a job that we all have to, I think, bring to our kids the same degree of concern, that I think perhaps was fueled by the fear that was generated in our own generation. I'm not so sure that isn't such a bad formula for reminding people of just how real that threat is. Because once again, there is no such thing as a contained nuclear war. So there are many things that are going to happen over the course of the next few days, not the least of which Jim and Janet are going to be writing an op-ed piece in the New York Times. I hope you enjoy this extraordinary amount of creative work that you'll see Koji Matsutani has put together. He's a young man. Koji, could you stand up so people know he's right there? And he has helped Jim and Janet and the rest of us that have been involved in this project make this relevant for every generation today, most particularly the youth. And judging from the response that Jim and Janet are getting through blogs and other forms in the media, it's actually very encouraging. So it gives me a great deal of honor to be able to introduce to you Janet Lang and Jim Blight, the authors of the book, those that have dedicated their lives to pointing to us this issue of the nuclear threat and hoping for a better world of peace. My dear friends.
Appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, Don. One of the real treats of moving up to Canada, which we did in 2010, has been just meeting wonderful, wonderful people. Don Morrison, being embedded in this terrific community of the Balsillie School and CG, where we have like-minded colleagues that support us. And so we're in your debt, and we appreciate it. And one of the things we love is that it's really important here to bring our message to the community. That's something that we care deeply about. We can have coffee with our academic colleagues, but we don't need to present to our academic colleagues. We need to get the word out, and so we really appreciate it. We like the fact that CG is so committed to that and have these wonderful event staff. And we, of course, then depend and appreciate that you've come out tonight. So thanks very much. I think Jim and I would like to start then with actually a little applause to the audience. So thank you very much to you guys. Okay, so what do we want to do tonight? we want to actually invite you, this actually isn't working, so I don't want to talk to that bit here. We actually want to invite you into a time machine that we're going to try to construct. We want to bring you to Cuba in October 1962. Now, some of you may have some memories of this, many of you don't. So we're going to be a vicarious trip that we're going to take. And what we want to do is we want to talk to you about what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we don't have a speech defect. We're just double that Cuba because we need to emphasize it. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one way to think about this aspect that's often ignored is that, especially in this time of the 50th anniversary, what you have is a lot of information out there about the missile crisis. And I would say we could sort of think about it this way. Maybe there's a ton of information out there about Kennedy. Good man, very lucky that he was president. Maybe a half-ton information about Nikita Khrushchev. We're all incredibly indebted to Nikita Khrushchev for getting us out of it. Of course, Kennedy and Khrushchev got us into it. We'll get to that too. And maybe 2 pounds worth of information about Cuba. And that's really a problem because it's understanding what's going on in the theater of operations that is really crucial to appreciating lessons that have implications for today. And so at our peril, do we only think about Washington and Moscow? So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to try to transport you to Havana. Now, we can sort of begin, in a sense, with a big question. We're going to get into the fine-grained details, and we hope into the psychology of Castro and Cubans in 1962. But we want to keep in mind that really we're doing this, we're not historians. We're doing this because we think it has important implications for today. So we want to keep in the back of our mind, who cares about the missile crisis? Why should we care about the missile crisis? And we're actually going to begin our answer with a short film from our transmedia project, something that Koji is definitely at the forefront. And we joke that Koji Masutani is one of the hardest jobs in the world. He has to drag the two of us from the 20th century all the way into the 21st century. And he's doing it. We're learning such words as transmedia. We're learning that a platform isn't necessarily something that you stand on. I mean, had no idea of this a couple of years ago. But what he's done is he's created this amazing website for us. It's very dynamic, and we encourage you to go in and play with it to get a sense of this aspect of the missile crisis. And we try in there to give attention, in a sense, to 3 mini biographies of Fidel, of Nikita, and of Jack Kennedy. Tonight we're going to focus on Fidel, but all 3 are crucial in there. And what you see is, here's our exciting front page, and you see all the different buttons and whatnot that you can sort of play with on there. And what you have is the stories and the experiences of these 3 guys. They wrote what we call the Armageddon letters, a series of correspondence between each other. Took place before the missile crisis began, after the missile crisis began, and they're windows into the minds of these people. And so what we do is, with the research that we've done for over 25 years on this crisis, which involved lots of work with people that were in Moscow, in Washington, and in Havana during that time, is we try to create for you with this time machine what it was like when these people were writing their letters and what it was like when these people were reading the letters. What's the sense of what's happening there?
A big puzzle about fascination with the Cuban Missile Crisis is why? What does it have to say to us? Probably the main reason is that it shows, believe it or not, that a nuclear war is possible even if nobody wants it. This is the scary thing. See, if some demented Hitler or something got a hold of nuclear weapons and just wanted to create mayhem all over the world, doesn't he? Including nuclear mayhem. Well, that's a kind of a problem, and you can't say it's impossible, but it's not the real problem. It certainly wasn't the problem in the missile crisis. Problem is you are not prepared for the change that takes place in here and in here, in your gut. When things careen out of control, when planes fly over the wrong places, when things turn up where they're not supposed to be, when people get angry or exhausted and give you bad advice, when the intelligence is looking very sparse and even counterintuitive, when all of this stuff is going on, and it's going on in 3 different places, and everybody is making assumptions that are consistent with what they originally believed but are not open to the facts as they're coming in, then you get people making decisions under tremendous stress, under wrong assumptions, and at that point, if we come into the missile crisis, we come in at about the last weekend, and I can guarantee you that none of the people in Moscow or in Washington who were managing this, and probably a lot of them in Cuba, nobody really could figure out what was going on. I mean, does Khrushchev want a war? God, it doesn't make any sense. Khrushchev's thinking Kennedy wants a war. I saw him last year. He didn't seem like that kind of a guy. Now, Castro has his own problems. He knows, he thinks he knows that Kennedy wants a war, but only a little tiny war with Cuba. It's a crisis. Crisis. Think about that. Repeat this word over and over again. Crisis. Because if you, sitting there in front of your computer terminal or with your phone, and you're saying, these people, what are they worried about? If nobody wants it, you won't get it. Have you ever got something you didn't want? What if that thing you didn't want was all-out nuclear war? What if that was on your shoulders? You put that load up here, unexpected, and you start to crack and crumble. You're in a crisis, and you wish you were your real self, but you're not. And you can't prepare for it. Because to do a simulation of a deep crisis is just a simulation. It's just pretend. You can only do this once. This has to be the first time for you, if you're in charge. And you do not know what in the hell is going on, or if the other guy has already decided he wants a war, or, as was worried, a deep worry in Washington, Khrushchev may not want a war, but what if there's a coup? This was discussed. A coup, the military takes over and they launch. And tens of millions of Americans die because you didn't launch first. That's the kind of stuff people are telling you. You weren't prepared. How do you prepare? You don't prepare. That's why you got to get rid of the weapons.
At the big picture. And you've seen now Jim on the big screen, and now here's Jim right here.
It's kind of embarrassing. That's a lot better than the real thing, I'm afraid. And we'll get to the animated Jim, but that's even better yet. So why are we here? We're not here to tell the standard story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The standard story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is roughly the following. Really bad people called Russians put a lot of really big threatening weapons into Cuba, and a really good-looking, steely-spined American president resisted, forced the bad guy to take the missiles back to where he sent them from, and that was that. Nobody lives in Cuba. There's not anything going on in Cuba. It is a parking lot for missiles with a few palm trees. There's nobody on that island that makes any difference whatsoever to this event. That's the standard 13-day story. We take second to nobody on God's earth in our love for the Kennedys. They did a lot of really good things. But one of the things that Robert Kennedy did is he wrote a campaign book when he was running for president in 1968 called 13 Days, and it is a great book. It's spine-tingling, but it's a campaign document, such that McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, when he received the manuscript, went to Bobby Kennedy and said, "I really like this book, but I just have this question. Didn't your brother have something to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis?"
Bobby Kennedy's answer was yes, but
Yeah,
he's not
but he's
running.
not running this year. Now that tells you a lot about the Kennedys. So, look, the reason the missile crisis occurred comes from Cuba. The reason it was so dangerous comes from Cuba. Cuba was the mouse that roared, to invoke a truly hilarious Peter Sellers early film from the Cold War era. Cuba was the mouse that roared. Cuba made such a difference that we would not have to discuss this stupid event every 5 years since 1987. But people don't get it. They're not understanding that you have to put yourself on the island. You got to sweat with the Cubans. You got to get into the very peculiar Cuban psychology of the time. And if you do, then you will understand exactly the kind of situation in which, for example, you do not want to put Iranians or Israelis or Pakistanis or anybody else who's got nuclear weapons or who might have nuclear weapons.
So what we want to talk about then is not 13 days, but what we call 18 months. And that takes us back to April of 1961, where you had the Bay of Pigs invasion, where, at least on the US side, it is often called the perfect failure, which is a good description of the event. You had a bunch of Cuban exiles who were trained by the CIA, equipped by the CIA, transported by the CIA, in a CIA-developed protocol to attack the island of Cuba. And the idea was that if these exiles set foot on Cuban territory, suddenly the whole population in Cuba would rally to support. They would overthrow Fidel. We'd put up another leader who was friendly to the Americans. That was the scenario. The problem is it collided with the real event. The real event was that within 3 days, the Cuban militia had absolutely decimated the exiles. They were either killed or in jail or in a swamp. It was over in 3 days, and it was a huge humiliation for Kennedy.
You see, the 13 days thing even affects our brain. You know, now we've
3
got
days.
the Bay of Pigs taking 13 days.
Right, 3
Right.
days. It was a huge humiliation for Kennedy. It was an opportunity for Castro to consolidate the regime. Now, what's interesting is that you can imagine, no big deal, they really beat the exiles, which in their mind is they beat the US. So you can imagine their celebration in Cuba. That's no big deal. But there's way more going on in Cuba than celebration, and that's what we need to pay attention to. So first of all, we're going to just go through very quickly a few of the assumptions that come immediately after the Bay of Pigs and in the ensuing 18 months between the Bay of Pigs and the 13 days. So Castro, what does he believe? He believes that Kennedy cannot tolerate a communist Cuba at all. That it's just basically what he's thinking is, yeah, we won this time, but Kennedy's getting ready. And the next time the Marines will come here, and it's going to be a big deal. And it's not if, it's when. Now, this is very plausible. It's not like Castro is a paranoid. It's very plausible. He just happened to be wrong because Kennedy did indeed have a different view of it, like, get me out of here.
Second, and directly related to the first point, is that Fidel concludes, and not only Fidel, but the whole leadership concludes, that Kennedy will have to demonstrably destroy the Cuban Revolution, liquidate the leadership, and reverse the revolutionary process, or he has no political future. Now, why would he think a thing like this? Well, there's already assassination attempts that are occurring on a regular basis on the leadership, but particularly against Fidel Castro. So that the conclusion that this guy cannot really expect to even run for president in 1964 unless he destroys the Cuban Revolution is not an irrational thought. But Kennedy didn't think this. I mean, I don't think he ever had this thought. I think the thought he did have was That goddamn little island is driving me crazy, and I want it off my agenda. I want to talk to the Russians about arms control. I want a comprehensive test ban. I want all that stuff. Just get this Cuban issue away from me. This is so far from what Fidel concluded, though, that it's amazing.
However, it can't just totally get off Kennedy's agenda, because there's all kinds of other reasons, local domestic issues, that he has to keep sort of, I'd say, futzing around with Cuba. But in Kennedy's mind, this is just going to sort of be, well, I have to sort of do something, but, you know, it's not going to be really serious. Well, what does he do? He, again, keeps going with the exiles in a program called Operation Mongoose. That's essentially state-sponsored terrorism on the island. Now, Kennedy thinks this is sort of a low-level, no big deal, knows it can't overturn the Castro regime kind of thing. Well, again, it looks different if you're in Cuba. It looks like this is more and more of the ratcheting up, right? A factory blows up here, a ship blows up here. They don't think of this as a little thing. So total miscommunication in terms of what is being done.
Fourth, and as remarkable as any of these conclusions, Castro concludes that because on April 15th, he gave a speech just before the invasion saying, I have always been a socialist, this is going to be a socialist revolution, I will always be a socialist. That on that, more or less that basis alone, that Cuba now falls underneath the Soviet nuclear umbrella, just like Eastern Europe does. They have joined the East Bloc, even though they're actually located in the West by 8,000 miles or so. So that if, this is long before Khrushchev gets the idea to put missiles in Cuba, if they attack us, if the US attacks us, if they invade us with the intention to occupy the island and destroy the revolution, if this happens, the Soviet Union will nuke the United States of America and destroy it. That's his assumption. Now, later on, when Khrushchev understands this, he thinks this is insane. This is crazy. But he didn't ask, and he wasn't listening. Kennedy wasn't listening either.
So then we progress through the summer, and what you now have is Khrushchev is getting the idea, in addition to all of the conventional weapons that he's putting in there, because by the way, Khrushchev concludes the same thing that Castro did after the Bay of Pigs, that, well, the Americans lost this time, but they're not losers. They're gonna come in with the big boys, and I better do something to protect Cuba. So he's been sending in a lot of conventional arms, and then he gets the idea, nuclear arms. Now the Cubans immediately say to him, we think you should do this publicly, honestly, and legally. We're an independent country, you're an independent country, we don't need to ask the permission of the US, we can form an official sort of collaboration on this and do it right. Nikita just thinks this is the stupidest thing he's ever heard and absolutely gives it no credence. Now, it's an arguable point, and one can argue it sort of either way. The point is that the Cubans thought they knew the Americans well and had a sense of how this would not play well if it was a surprise. And Khrushchev's, again, he's not listening on any of this.
Finally, this fits hand in glove with a long tradition of Cuban resistance to the Spanish, out of the 19th century comes a very strong glorification of martyrdom in the face of certain military defeat. Both of the great Cuban heroes of that revolution, General Antonio Maceo, the black general who refused to compromise again and again and again with the Spanish, and Jose Marti, the poet of the revolution, called in Cuba the apostle, El Postal of the revolution, who died in 1895 fighting the Spanish. This becomes, for Fidel Castro, a kind of, I mean, it's hard to imagine maybe sitting in comfortable seats here in Ontario, but these are role models. A line out of the Cuban national anthem is, I will die facing the sun. It's how you die that counts. Because so many Cubans have died over the years in fighting the Spanish, and now they're going to they're going to die fighting the American imperialists. We asked Sergei Khrushchev, our longtime colleague at Brown, about what his father thought about all this, because Fidel talked like this all the time. He made speech after speech about this. And Sergei said, my father would take his hand and he would hold it up by his head like this and say, Fidel is just shooting off his mouth. He wasn't. He actually believed that.
So what you have is for 18 months, Castro conveying his thoughts to the world. These are all public documents. They're speeches that he gives and so forth. But Kennedy's not listening, Khrushchev's not listening, and to their peril, they're not listening. Now, it turns out that actually Khrushchev's big gamble to put in the missiles secretly almost but not quite works. Close but no cigar. And on October 22nd in 1962, Kennedy gives a speech to the nation and to the world that we describe as the scariest speech that was ever delivered by a US president, because effectively he is sort of throwing out the gauntlet and saying to Khrushchev, if you do X, we'll blow up the world. That's pretty scary. Now, what's interesting and needs to be kept in mind is that this is what Kennedy is saying publicly. We know from documents, from tapes that he made, that a different Kennedy is working publicly already at that point to try to ratchet things down in terms of a military response.
We've got a 20-second timeout here?
Privately.
He's so wonderful. I happen to be in chemo, so I can call that an excuse. It's a wonderful perk of cancer, and he corrects me all the time. Yes, publicly, the scariest speech ever. Privately, Kennedy is actually working his tail off to make sure that we get a peaceful settlement. So you need to keep those in mind. But first of all, let's go to the public.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Okay, so one of the things to appreciate is that when Kennedy says requiring a full retaliatory response, what he's talking about there is blowing up the world. He's talking about massive nuclear hit on Cuba, well, certainly Cuba's long gone, and that's way below the sea, but he's also talking about the Soviet Union and even China at this point. And then they retaliate, and there we are. Now, what is interesting to notice, though, in Kennedy's speech, he is not at all talking about Cuba in any interesting way. He's certainly not talking about Castro, and he's actually not even talking about communism. All he's talking about is hardware that happens to be parked on an island called Cuba, and that hardware can reach the US. But let's go to where that hardware is.
Okay, so one of the dangers of coming to a talk by people who studied something for 25 years is that 4 billion facts are all equally interesting, and you got to keep us under short leash. Let's try it. It's the 26th, 27th of October, 1962. We're on the island. We are just west of the city of Havana, not far from where a big hotel complex is now, something that Canadians know well and something that Americans drool about but cannot visit. The Soviets are working 24 hours a day to make the missiles operational. They feel that if they can make them operational, then the Americans will be deterred from attacking. Possibly true. Kennedy wants to know, he wants as close to real-time data as he can get as to what is the status of these missile sites in Cuba, because it'll have something to do with whether he decides to give the go to an attack on Cuba. If they attack Cuba, he's told, that's fine. I mean, that'll be the beginning of it, but it won't be the end, because who knows whether we got them all. We have to know that we got them all, because a missile coming from Cuba can destroy Miami or Atlanta or New Orleans, maybe even Washington, D.C., and that's not going to be a good war. So that that means we're going to have an invasion. So the invasion force is poised by this point. Now that's Kennedy's perspective. I need intelligence. So what he does after this speech is he orders not just the U-2s to fly over Cuba at 75,000 feet. He orders low-flying, very high-speed photographic jets to come in at about 50 feet off the ground and at about 650 miles an hour. Now, the idea that you could invent a camera that could take very good high-resolution pictures with all these things going on is amazing. These are Vought F-8 Crusaders. This is their first mission. They have just come off the assembly line. The pilots are so excited to be flying them.
Now, here, imagine this incredible plane that's going to be coming over Cuba. We just want to give you a hint. In Cuba, this is the anti-aircraft that they have.
This is what Ulysses S. Grant had in the American Civil War. I mean, this thing is not going to work.
I mean,
try
turning
going to hit anything,
that,
much
right?
less a jet going 650 miles an hour, 50 feet over your head. But
this
look at them. Look how proud they are. I mean, they got a gun. It's an old Russian gun from God knows which World War.
But this is what they have. But what's even burning in their soul, so this is what they have, and they're told at this point they can't even use this.
Right. Khrushchev's given the order, nobody shoots at anything because that could start the war. The Cuban point of view is start the war. The war started last year, maybe 10 years ago, maybe in 1895. By God, there's war here. These planes, the next plane that flies over, that may not be taking pictures. These planes can drop bombs. Maybe that's the start of the war. Fidel, late in the afternoon, gets in his Jeep and his driver, and he goes out near where the Comodoro Hotel is. You may have been there. Just west of the city. While he's there, the men tell him, I can't go on like this. This is humiliating. Why are we doing it? Why are we just waiting to be killed? This is ridiculous. This isn't Cuban at all. Fidel has to sort of agree with it. And just then, 2 jets fly over. And they rattle his brains.
Yeah.
What we're going to show you is to try to give you some sense of the difference between sitting in an office in Washington or Moscow and dealing with this situation and what it was like on the ground. This is you're going to see a French Mirage. It is not a Crusader. This guy has lead weights in his boots. He has super thick things on, and he's also a good athlete because he knows what's coming. But this is more or less the experience of the Cubans hundreds of times during a very short period of the missile crisis. This was their experience. Planes travel typically in pairs, and every time they come over, it gets worse because you know what you're in for, you know you'll be humiliated, and you know you're not permitted to do anything about it. One more time. Fidel's brain gets rattled, he gets in his Jeep, he goes right back to his headquarters in south central Havana, and he says, screw the Russians, we're shooting them down. Shoot down everything you can get at. Everything. We can only hit the low flyer, well, we can only shoot at the low flyers. Whether he hit anything is a different story, but at least we'll be doing something. We are not going to be capitulating by passivity to the Yankees. And so from that point on, the Cubans shoot at everything that flies over. During the crisis, they hit 1, possibly 2 planes. They didn't bring any down.
Amazing that he did.
But that's not the end of the story, because the Russians on the island felt the contagion. They felt too, why are we here? What are we doing here? We should protect ourselves. And the Russians had this surface-to-air missiles that could shoot down the U-2s, and the shoot down of a U-2, it turns out, will almost plunge the world into nuclear war.
In between that period where Fidel is now saying, shoot, do the best we can, his mind is still incredibly agitated. And so he drives at 2 in the morning to the Russian embassy there, the Soviet embassy. And he and the ambassador, Alexander Alexeyev, they go downstairs into their bunker. And Fidel said the next thing he needs to do is he needs to write a letter to Khrushchev. This is one of the most famous Armageddon letters that has ever been written. They work all through the night. It goes through 10 drafts. This is not something that he just dictates and sends off. This is really, really hard. He's trying to convey the information of what it's like and the feeling of what it's like to be in Havana then to Khrushchev in Moscow. It's what we think of as one of the most blood-curdling documents that we've ever come across. And I want to read just a couple of paragraphs to you. Dear Comrade Khrushchev, from an analysis of the situation and the reports in our possession, I consider that the aggression is almost imminent within the next 24 to 72 hours. There are 2 possible variants. The first and the likeliest one is an attack against certain targets with a limited objective of destroying them. The second, and less probable, though possible, is an invasion. I understand that this variant would call for a large number of forces, and it is, in addition, the most repulsive form of aggression. Now, a quick aside. Fidel is actually wrong on one thing here. He thinks there's 2 separate options of a bombing attack only and a bombing attack plus an invasion. But as Kennedy is learning about what is involved, as Jim said, it's very clear to him right away that if he goes down that route, the 2 are conjoined. So any military action that he takes, it's going to involve the bombing and the invasion. There's not 2 separate variants. Fidel then continues his letter to Khrushchev. If the second variant is implemented and the imperialists invade Cuba with the goal of occupying it, the danger that aggressive policy poses for humanity is so great that following that event, the Soviet Union must never allow the circumstances in which the imperialists could launch a first strike against it. I tell you this because I believe the imperialist aggressiveness is extremely dangerous. And if they carry out the brutal act of invading Cuba, that would be the moment to eliminate such danger forever through an act of clear, legitimate defense, however harsh and terrible the solution would be, for there is no other.
Alexeyev, at one point, here's about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, bleary-eyed. Fidel is walking around eating sausages, which he did when he got nervous in those days. Alexeyev goes into a side office and sends a quick cable, an encoded cable to Khrushchev, because he's not sure that Khrushchev's going to understand what's going on, because there's all these drafts, and Alexeyev's Spanish is not perfect, Fidel's Russian is non-existent, they've got translators, but they're exhausted too. So he says, dear Comrade Khrushchev, if the Americans invade with the intention to occupy the island, what Comrade Fidel is saying to you is, quote, wipe them off the face of the earth. Khrushchev gets this cable. He's in a very tense meeting of the Soviet leadership. According to his son Sergei, who had this reported to him that night, his father stood straight up and shouted, "This is insane!" Fidel is trying to drag us into the grave with him. That's it. We're out of here. There are a lot of reasons to be out of here, but this is a very good reason. Nobody shoots anything without my signature. I want all those things put in the crates. I want them brought back. We are done, finished, game over.
Now, the question is, was Khrushchev right? Was Castro crazy?
One of the most interesting questions regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis has to do with Fidel Castro and whether, to use a colloquial expression, he was crazy. Why is this an interesting question? Well, clearly, in the middle of the world's most dangerous nuclear crisis, to have one of the three leaders involved having, if it's true, if it were to be true, having lost his mind, that is deeply disturbing. Americans were overflying the island dozens of times every day with supersonic aircraft that were taking pictures of the development of the missile sites and other related stuff. Now, they are asking their leader, their fearless leader, Fidel Castro, shouldn't we be doing something? I mean, they're taking so many pictures, they're going to know exactly where all of us are. Fidel hears this, he feels it himself. And so contrary to his orders, he orders all the Cuban troops to open fire on anything within your range. Any plane that comes over, if you hear it, see it, turn that gun around and try to bring it down. This is a morale builder. It is also a message to the Soviets. We're here to fight this. We are not here to cave in, give in, relinquish our sovereignty. We're not going to do it. We, the Cubans, are not going to do it. Your problem if you want to do something different, but we're here to fight this thing to the conclusion. I didn't try to start a war. The war is already on. The war started the year before. 10 years before. The Americans have treated Cuba like dirt all this time, and finally, we're standing up for ourselves. I mean, I think that would be the response. Is that crazy in this situation? Or should he, for example, have capitulated? The fact that he didn't, does that make him crazy? I think in order to reach that conclusion, he was crazy. He had kind of lost it. He couldn't handle the stress. He was irresponsible because he was in a nuclear situation that could have really blown up into a catastrophe, and here he was getting violent and aggressive all of a sudden. I mean, I understand the argument, but put yourself in his shoes. Put yourself on the island of Cuba. Your people are being set up, that's what it looks like from the island. Your people are being set up for a massive hit. It'll have two parts. There'll be, as we now know from American documents, 1,280 sorties, that is 1,280 flights to the island in the initial phase, all with bombs. That's a lot of bombs. Small island, a lot of bombs. That's the air attack, and there's going to be an invasion. Try to take over the island, kill the leadership, and do the usual kind of imperialist thing, as the Cubans saw it. What can they do? I would suggest that this situation is not all that different from the ending of a famous U.S. movie from the early 1970s called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Butch Cassidy played by Paul Newman, the Sundance Kid played by Robert Redford, both young and extremely good looking. Are holed up in a hut in Bolivia with almost the entire Bolivian police force, army, all encircling them around the hills. They look at each other. End of movie, last scene, last 45 seconds. They look at each other. Here's the choice. To be shot to death, let them burn the hut, it's all over, or, by God, could we take a few of these bastards with us? They're injured, they're bleeding, they grab their guns, they come ripping out of that hut, and the camera freezes on them as they come out, each of them smiling. End of movie. Gunshots go off for about 20 seconds while the credits start to roll. I ask you, does the director of that movie want you to think that these guys were crazy, had lost their minds, or are they heroes? Are they heroic? I think it's a no-brainer in that situation. However they got to that situation. After all, these guys are crooks. I mean, they don't really have any redeeming social value other than their pretty faces. They're crooks. But in that situation, they behaved heroically. I think that's what the message is. And I'd suggest to you that if you see differences between that and the ending or the near ending of the missile crisis, well, good. I'd like you to send that in. I'd like to see it because I don't think Fidel Castro was crazy. I do think the situation, if you could think of it this way, the situation was crazy. The situation was perverse and the options were few. But I also think we don't ever want to create that situation again where a leader has only the option to take his country down for no reason or to take his country down along with some of those bastards in addition. We want to try to avoid that. So by October 26, 27, 1962, Castro has assumed that Cuba is doomed. Doomed in the usual sense, but not really doomed, because this is more like a dream than a nightmare, I think, to him at this point. Cuba will matter, finally. The country that's been beaten up, used up by the Spanish and then by the Americans, has been invaded 5 times by the Americans in the 20th century up to this point. This country will be the hinge of the world. You have to factor into it a massive personality, filled up with himself. He's 36 years old. He's full of energy. He's full of piss and vinegar. He thinks he can do just about anything, and he is about to die the most beautiful death any Cuban has ever dreamed of. And he has spent 18 months trying to convince his constituents that that is their fate as well. And in trying to convince them of it, it's obvious that he has convinced himself all the more. What would have happened? Well, we know that one U-2 was shot down on the morning, late in the morning of October 27th. The word got to Kennedy in the afternoon, and at that moment, remember, this is fed by Cuban enthusiasm, picked up by the Russians on the island, who are violating their own rules in shooting the U-2 down. It gets to Kennedy, and for several hours, probably that was the most dangerous several hours in the history of the world. People immediately said, Khrushchev must have made this decision. He must want to go to war. I know it doesn't make any sense. But look, there's a dead pilot down there. We can't send in any more reconnaissance aircraft unless we send in the attack planes. We're going to do that. We've got to send in the Marines. We're going to send in the Marines. We're going to take over the island. This crescendo of aggression, is just pouring down on John F. Kennedy. Kennedy says, not yet. Not yet. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day. We now know that there were roughly 100 warheads for tactical nuclear weapons around the beaches in Cuba. CIA thought there were 0. If the invasion had taken place, the nuclear war would have started in a way the Americans hadn't really thought through. They wouldn't have started it. It would have started on the island. They would have gone in without nuclear weapons, and they would have been incinerated on the beaches in Cuba. And at that point, even Kennedy would have had absolutely no viable option other than resignate. He could have resigned, but he wouldn't have. He would have had to respond with nuclear weapons, and Cuba would have been completely destroyed exactly according to the scenario that had been in Fidel Castro's mind for the past 18 months.
So what you have here is the possibility of the beginning of the end. And again, we want to emphasize that the important actions, the important evolutions are occurring in Cuba, and nobody's really paying attention to that until at the very end, Kennedy and Castro and Khrushchev pull back. But this was a real possible scenario here. So we want to again sort of take a little bit of a big picture look. So what? So what? It almost happened, but it didn't. Should we just feel lucky? We think it's better to not rely on luck, although luck was crucial there. We want to just quickly summarize with what we take to be two important takeaways. The first one is that if you really get into the fine-grained detail of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you appreciate something that I think is just stunning, really, in its implications. And that is that Armageddon is possible. It really is possible. We don't have to go to science fiction to think about that. We go to history, to what almost happened. It's possible. But here's the kicker that I think is even more upsetting. It's possible even when people don't want it. A lot of people get very complacent thinking, you know, these weapons, everybody understands, it's the end of the world, they would never do it because they would be committing suicide. That's not enough to have people guaranteed to not use them. Armageddon is possible even if no one wants it.
Second, you would think you wouldn't need to say this after the Vietnam War, that the United States of America, particularly the United States of America, but all big powers, you better listen to what the little people are saying. Little people is a favorite phrase of Castro all through the time he was in power, all through the 50 years. You better listen to the little people because they can drag you down if you don't understand them. If they feel they are put in a situation where the only option is to die meaninglessly or to die meaningfully, that is a situation you do not want to put them in. Now, is this what's happening in the Middle East? We're going to leave that open. We'd be happy to address that. We've done a fair amount of work on Iran, Israel, US, Pakistan, and so forth. But in 2012, it's pretty clear that this lesson has not been totally absorbed into the marrow of, I'll say, US foreign policy. Far from it. I think the war in Iraq, the continuation of the war in Afghanistan, the potential for a war against Iran, the rather careless and reckless way that both candidates, but particularly Romney, have talked about this issue in the campaign, this is not reassuring.
And actually, we could add a teeny little kicker, just in case you're not feeling bad enough already. We can just add one more little thing, and that is big powers must empathize with, doesn't even have to be small countries, other countries for their own good. The US has a wonderful history of being equally arrogant with other large countries and small countries. So I think the bigger lesson there is empathize with your adversaries and enemies, not because you're just wonderful people, but for your own good.
My dear.
Now, on that, we thank you for your attention. We would be delighted. Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
we really
you.
appreciate
Normally
that.
we have questions passed in, but tonight I think we'd depart
there's
from that.
going to be some microphones around. Is that right, Fred?
One on each side.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to take your questions for a few minutes.
And so, yeah, your turn. Questions that you have.
How many people here remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Whoa, we want to hear from some of you. We've done a lot of stuff here for the younger generation, but by God, we have some 20th century content to contribute to these kids' brains, so come on, let's have it.
Yeah. And you
We screwed up a lot.
but you younger guys, questions from you too as well. So field is open, and then we'll obviously go out for the exhibit and have part 2 of the evening. But right now, your turn.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. How much would you put this down to not just not empathizing with someone else or your enemy? What about just the basic fact of intelligence failure? Especially, you mentioned the Bay of Pigs, going back that far at least. So it's not just not empathizing, it's a lack of knowing what you're doing.
Well, I think one of the ways
point.
that we think about empathy is that really empathy is good intelligence, right? I mean, what you want to understand as well as you can is who's your adversary? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Now, typically that is done in terms of many externalities. You know, how many weapons do they have? What kind of strategic alignment? Where do they place them? Blah, 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 and so on. And that, as surely is imperfect, to say the least. Actually, there's a very interesting, quickie little side digression on the Bay of Pigs part. Here, actually...
Be careful, there's no such thing as a short digression on
but
anything
you will
related
keep me,
to this subject.
You will keep me in bounds. But on the Bay of Pigs thing, one of the things that's so interesting when you get into it is that it started out as a bigger plan. And Kennedy's not a happy camper with it. He doesn't like it. It gets shrunk, shrunk, shrunk. Now, what's interesting is the CIA, people who are designing this and who are working hand in glove with the exiles and are true believers that they, you know, in what they do, they know that this plan is being eviscerated. But here's the kicker. All the way up from the station chief up to the head of the CIA, they believe that what they're doing is they're backing Kennedy into a corner. And they know that when the exiles come, it's going to be a mess. But they believe once Kennedy sees the blood on the ground, he will have no choice other than to send in the Marines. Kennedy keeps telling them, I'm not doing it, I'm not doing it. They don't believe him. So that's a really interesting, you know, point on that, and points up an interesting aspect of Kennedy. But you know, so the intelligence is sort of the bombs and bullets part, but good intelligence is also the history, the culture. What are these people saying? What are they saying about you? All that kind of stuff.
The Bay of Pigs was the luckiest thing that ever happened to John F. Kennedy. He paid a price, but he didn't pay a huge price. It was a big political price. There was talk of impeachment in April of 1961.
David actually has a fabulous, I'm going to copy you, a wonderful phrase to talk about that point of the Bay of Pigs as sort of being the best thing. Dave calls it the teenage car accident, right? That it's sort of a little, you know, you dent the fender, but you're not really seriously hurt, but you're a better driver after because of it.
Yeah.
Very good analogy. We love to steal from our friends. Yes, yes, sir.
Was there anyone in Moscow or Washington who really thought they could get all the nukes on the other side, all the silos, blow them all up without successful retaliation?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Were there people either in Washington or Moscow who thought that if they struck first, they would get the other party's missiles, planes, subs, whatever, before they could launch their weapons? Yes, absolutely. At this time, it's hard to imagine it, but anyone in here seen Dr. Strangelove? 1964, Stanley Kubrick, the greatest Cold War film ever made. Kubrick set out to make a serious film, but he couldn't do it because everything seemed so absurd. But the thing that seemed so absurd to him, that is the splendid first strike, that was the term that came out of the Rand Corporation and that made its way through the US establishment, was that you had this small and shrinking window, 1960, 1961, 62. The projections were that the Soviets would reach such a capacity by 63 maybe, anyway, imminently, that the splendid first strike would no longer be an option. And you might say, well, so what? Well, but this is a group of people who think that they won the Second World War more or less all by themselves with air power. Curtis LeMay, who is General Buck Turgison, played by George C. Scott, in the movie, when asked, like the president, played by Peter Sellers, says, well, what should we expect? And Buck Turgison, chewing gum through the whole thing, says, well, we launch first 10 to 20 million, not sure, but depending on the breaks. The president, Sellers, says, that's not war. That's just an atrocity. Well, yes, but Buck Turgison had a real-life analog, and that was General Curtis LeMay. LeMay can be listened to. You can go to the many websites, Kennedy Library being one, you can listen to LeMay confronting the president. You can also watch Koji Masatani's virtual JFK, Vietnam if Kennedy had lived, because there's a section on the missile crisis where LeMay says, right in the middle of the crisis, you got no option but war. None. We're going to war. You have no political option.
There's another part,
Kennedy
too.
basically walks away from that.
There's another part of that same conversation where LeMay is saying, you have to strike now. And Kennedy says, well, what will they do in response? And LeMay says, they'll do nothing.
Nothing.
Now, why? What's interesting here, and it gets us back to these two aspects of intelligence. LeMay's mind, what he is thinking about is that at this point, the U.S. has overwhelming superiority, something like 17-1 in terms of deliverable nuclear weapons. And of course, conventionally in the Caribbean area, my God, I mean, we own that territory, right? So the U.S. has enormous...
No, we're in Canada now. You can't. They don't own it, but the Americans.
The
own
Americans own it.
Sorry.
We're still
getting used to this.
Our permanent residency application is in, but it has not yet been approved.
We sent it to Buffalo. They closed the Buffalo office. They sent them to Detroit. They lost everything. So we sent it all over last month.
But anyway, so
Please
we're in
take
process, right? We're proto-Canadians. Okay, but anyway, so LeMay is thinking of this kind of intelligence, 17-1. I mean, do what you want, John. They can't do a darn thing back. Different kind of intelligence. Kennedy is appreciating what one nuclear bomb could do. One destroys a city. It causes in the U.S. roughly the same level of destruction as the entire Civil War, which took well over 100 years to recover from. Never mind the notion of nuclear. So they're on two very different levels. And to our great fortune, the civilian leadership at that point is in charge. Let's go here and then here. Okay.
Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. I was on your website today, enjoying it immensely. I read something last week.
It's nice to hear that people of more senior than some of the others here also enjoy the website. Thank you for saying that.
No problem. In Canada, we call that a person d'une soutenage. Anyway, Jeffrey Lewis in Foreign Policy magazine wrote something very interesting about ballistic missile defense, that the Russians are tremendously worried that ballistic missile defense silos will be switched on the sly to launching missiles. Yeah. And that's why they don't. And there seems to be exactly the dynamic you're discussing about the lack of empathy for what the other side is thinking, because there's a whole rest of the analysis. What I'm trying to imagine, though, is at this moment, it seems kind of odd. It seems weird, it seems paranoid that the Russians would think that way. But they might. But who's going to listen to Jeffrey Lewis?
Missile defense, in our way of thinking, is one of the real bad guys here. I mean, I don't know if many of you remember, but when Gorbachev and Reagan met at Reykjavik, according to my understanding of what happened, they got pretty close to a place that no one even dreamed of before during the Cold War, and that is the abolition of nuclear weapons. But Reagan had an asterisk. He thought it was an asterisk of, well, but of course we'd want to put up missile defenses just in case one or two, somehow somebody cheated or some rogue state got one and so forth. The Russians didn't have to look very far to realize that they were about 72 light years behind the US in missile defense technology and would probably fall further behind if SDI is a strategic defense initiative, if it really got going, because they just, that's just the way it worked. The Americans always streak out ahead. So, and then Gorbachev said, no deal, no deal. Was he paranoid? I don't think he was paranoid. But we're dealing here with institutions and bureaucracies that have interests. And the current situation strikes me as one that ought to be talked about every day by senior Russian and US civilian and military people until they iron this thing out. Go to the sites, show them what it looks like. Well, see, but that's transparency, but that fights, everything about the Cold War was not about transparency, it was about secrecy. We haven't quite shed that yet. We're not, I don't think we have. And I think what you bring up here is one of the legacies of the Cold War. And let's not forget about the Second World War. The Second World War in the US is sort of like army movies and stuff. It was a good war, a lot of people died, yeah, sure, but okay. To people in Europe and Asia, that war happened and it keeps happening. It's a nightmare that they have yet to emerge from. And the Russians lost 20 million of their people. And this is not something you just get over. This is not, you don't just let your guard down when this sort of thing happens, I think.
Yeah. John, I think your point highlights that you don't need the adjective small there. Because I think what you're talking about is appreciating what, if you're in Russia, if you were the national security advisor in Russia and you see what the US policy is, what would your advice be? And how would you think about it? We did for a number of years a project on US-Soviet relations during the Carter-Brezhnev years, and Mark Garrison, our director at that time and leader in that project, is here. He's a long-term student of US-Soviet relations during that time, expert on that you can chat with about that. But one of the things that struck me immediately, what was interesting, this is the era when people talked about this, quote, two superpowers, and at every meeting, without fail, one of the issues that would come up to the table is in some form or another, some senior member of the Russian Soviet delegation at that point saying, and looking at their American counterparts saying, you never treated us with equal respect.
One of my favorite examples of this is a man named Georgy Kornienko, his last post was first deputy foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and he was second in command at the Soviet embassy in Washington during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so we had lots of reasons to deal with him. He said that basically his assumption was every time he went into a negotiation with the Russians that we would be treated like a blankety-blank banana republic. That probably tells you all you need to know about what he thought about Cuba, too, unfortunately. But that feeling that the U.S. cannot find it within itself to actually approach an ally or an adversary on the basis of what counts as equal respect. Not that what the U.S. counts as equal respect, but that it actually feels like that on the other side. That's something that needs some work, absolutely.
Now that seems to me, we're not students of Canadian history by any means, so we're never ready to take that exam yet. But from what we've gathered here...
NHL used to have 6 teams.
That I know. I can even name them. I know that. My mother, one of them was Boston. My birthday is the same birthday as Bobby Orr. That should be enough to get me permanent residency, for heaven's sake. Same date, right? I mean, not just the day. But
Bobby
anyway.
Orr.
But it does seem to me that one of the Canadian strengths, really, has been that sense of being an honest broker. and really trying to get a sense of what the parties are saying. Now, in this research that we do, the critical oral history that Dawn talked about, that's our role, to be honest brokers and to create a place where everyone feels like they're getting an opportunity to tell their story. The requirement is you've got to be able to ask the questions and so forth. But that seems to be something that is a Canadian sensibility that if really beefed up, can contribute important ways, I think.
One more.
Well, two more questions then.
Well,
so
we're a little late.
Okay, two more, and we'll.
All right.
But you
We'll
ask the
be quick.
questions, and we'll be quick in the answers. But we've already promised you, and then here, and then yes.
You know, a major part of your project was getting inside the heads of these three individuals who held the world's fate in their hands. As you're going through that in these extraordinary circumstances, how do you say that action or that response to that cable was in keeping with their character? I mean, how did you assess their responses to each briefing or cable or event?
Do you want to repeat the question?
So you're asking, in our attempt to get inside the framework or inside the brains of these guys,
Like as we're getting our sense,
Yeah.
how do we evaluate? How do we do our self-correction of did I get it right?
yeah.
And was that in keeping with who Castro really was or Kennedy? And
No.
was it an instinctive thing that saved us from the brink, or was it them departing from their instincts that saved us?
Oh, I see. That's an interesting question. Okay. So the three personalities, I mean, these are three incredibly interesting people. And the more that you can sort of absorb and try to get a sense of who these people are in lots of situations, the better. And I think for our work, that part of that is the key. You don't want to just sort of hermetically seal the missile crisis from anything else. So you want to get a sense of how are these people in lots of situations, first of all. I mean, that you really want to kind of get into that. And you begin to get a sense of how they act. And you know, I mean, it's always obviously a tentative kind of thing that needs to be tested and probed with lots of different, you know, documents and other people that knew him, situations, what did they actually do, blah, 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 blah. But one of the things that you find, let's say with regard to the missile crisis, is that traits that these people have, that's part of what got us into the missile crisis to begin with, okay? So bad. They flunk. On crisis prevention, they flunk.
They weren't listening
Okay?
to
But-
Castro, and that's how they got into it.
And
But thank
Castro
God they
is
weren't
up in
listening
the-
to Castro at the end, because I'm not sure we would have gotten out of it,
Right.
because he was already in a zone where only martyrs go.
Yeah. So part of the deal is they got us into it, but then in the crisis, boy, did they act statesmanlike. They took a lot of hits. They were willing to take some political hits to do it. We are here because of what they did. And it's certainly, I would say, mainly actually Khrushchev, Kennedy a very close second. Castro could have made things even worse. He does have his moments also of everybody stepping back from the brink. Final question?
Yes, final question?
I'm curious whether it's accurate that Fidel Castro has recently, like in the last few weeks, said that he was wrong and he's learned. And if you could comment on that. And what is it that's missing from the training program of our international leaders to keep them from coming up with solutions like shock and awe and preventive strike in Iran, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, I'm going to do the first part because that's the relatively easy one, and I'll leave Jim the hard part, and he can be thinking about that while I'm chatting briefly on that.
Shock and awe.
Actually, the last chapter of our book, which is called Hope, has the last of our Armageddon letters that we put in there is a transcription from a YouTube statement that Fidel Castro made in October of 2010, actually. And you are quite right that in 62 he acted the way we talked about. In 1992 at our conference in Havana there, he reiterated that I would do the same thing now. 2010, he's almost died in 2007. 2010, he was wrong. And actually what's very interesting is he becomes an evolution. He evolves into a nuclear abolitionist, actually. which is very, very interesting. So
He says in that statement, there's a lot of talk about collateral damage in a nuclear war. I've looked into this now, and the collateral damage in a nuclear war will be the human race. Therefore, all the weapons have got to be destroyed as soon as possible. This is
second part of the question.
shock and awe. What can we do about that? A little humility wouldn't hurt. If our individual is elected on November 6th, that probably won't hurt either.
It makes a huge difference who's president. In the missile crisis, it's hard to imagine. For example, you put Lyndon Johnson in as president, we're all poofed, gone. So it really matters who's president. With regard to Iraq, hard to imagine if the U.S. Votes had actually been counted in Gore's president. Inconceivable, actually, to imagine that there's that war. It matters who's president. So I think we need to really be vigorous in terms of building a civil society that cares about voting and pays attention to that.
But just a little postscript here that it's very difficult. One of the things you discover if you look into John F. Kennedy is that it becomes harder and harder to imagine that the guy with that tough guy rhetoric, that bear any burden, pay any price to defeat communism anywhere in the world, that's the same guy who held the Hawks at the barricades for 1,036 days. And that's exactly what he did. But how could you have known that when he was running against Richard Nixon? In the debate against one of the TV debates, back when they actually debated rather than just shouted at each other. But he criticized the Eisenhower administration for devoting insufficient attention to the ability to strike first with nuclear weapons. And he said, "You guys, the Republican administration talks about bringing color television to Americans. I think you should have thought more about throw weight." Now, that's the ability of a nuclear bomb to do certain things in a certain perimeter. It's also amazing. American people would have actually known what he was talking about back then. Now I have no such thought.
Listen, before we go to part two, we have one more teeny request of you. And that is, we're obviously a team, but we're a team within a team. And so we would like to bring up Don Morrison, Dave Welch, Koji Masutani up here. These are the three people that we have dedicated our book to. And could you guys just come up, because we would like to do a photo shoot. And we'd also like to add a fourth person to that, and that is Lauren Judge. And she needs to come up here as well, because
she saw versions of this book that no human being saw.
And Lauren also is an incredible colleague with regard to the art exhibit that we're going to do. So we just need to do just for us, we'd appreciate it. Two things.
These guys are good.
We want to do a group photo, and we want you guys to be clapping for everyone that's on the stage other than us. Okay, do it now. Yeah.